Welcome to another installment of Donning the Armor. This morning we will begin in 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 1. Again, David gathered all the choice men of Israel, 30,000. So following the conquest of Jerusalem, taking the city from the Jebusites, making it his capital of Israel now, the city of David, the city of Zion, the city of God, the center place for all Israel to this day, to be God's place on the world for his people. This city that, as far as David's time is concerned, is an easily defensible city. It was a walled city, a mighty city on cliffs, up a hill, so that way it made it more easily defensible. Although not completely impregnable, because David took it, and eventually the Romans will sack it and destroy it. Of course, same thing with the Babylonians, but that makes it a great city. And as far as tribal affiliations, this city is, even though it's in the land of Judah, had never at any point been under the control of any of the 12 tribes of Israel. So therefore, this city stood out apart from the rest of the land and made it so that David could make this the city and the center point, not setting up his place where his tribe is, where his people are from, not setting up his kingdom out of Bethlehem and building Bethlehem into this great giant city and fortress and power in the nation of Israel, but use this city that was unattainable until now, this city that was never in the hands of any of his people. So that way it is truly a neutral city. So after that, he has now set that up. He has a house of cedar that was brought on by the king of Tyre to try to make an alliance with him. Following these things, now David is gathering up his choice men once again for one more task, one more important task for David and in David's heart. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, whose name is called by the name, the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim. So now he's gathering up these 30,000 men, because he is now going to go get the ark from Baal Judah and bring it into the city of God. And this turn of phrase that's in the middle there, the ark of God, whose name is called by the name, the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim, that is called by the name, is called by Yahweh. The ancient and modern Jewish rabbis would not use the name Yahweh. That's why we don't particularly know even how it's pronounced. Hebrew didn't have vowels, so you guess the vowels. And that led to a lot of people believing the pronunciation was Jehovah. But as we've gotten more manuscripts, people lean more towards Yahweh. But back then, they wouldn't say the name. In our Bibles, in English, from the Septuagint, as they were translated, it's L-O-R-D, Lord, all capitals. That's where Yahweh would belong, or Jehovah would belong. But in the time of the rabbis, they wouldn't say that name either. They would just say the name. The Lord, the name is called by the name, because God's name was too holy for them to speak. They placed it much, much higher than we do. They held it to a higher standard, a standard that they wouldn't even speak the name. They would just refer to it as the name. It's something to be said about it, how high they put it up. But then you get the scripture that even speaks of God keeping his word above even his own name. His name is not the most important thing that has come from him. It's his word, it's his promise, it's his reconciliation and love for us. That's what's most important. but the Ark of the Covenant finally returning to where it belongs, in the center of his people. And Jerusalem, this new city with no previous affiliation, becomes the new center of his people. So they set the Ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drove the cart. Now they're placing it on a new cart. And now if we remember back to 1 Samuel, this is how the Philistines sent it back to Israel. After the sons of Eli lost it, after they were slaughtered, and God sent tumors and diseases and all these different afflictions on the Philistines as they moved it from city to city to city. They eventually consulted their holy people, and they came up with, you know what, let's make an offering to the God of Israel. We'll send the cart back. We'll put it on it. We'll use a cow that's never pulled a cart, never had a yoke on it, and we'll just, so that way we'll even take its young from it. And if it goes straight to the Israelites, then we'll know God has moved it. Otherwise, it'll try to pull off to its crying young. It'll buck under the yoke it's never held before. So this is what we'll do. We'll put it on a new cart. We'll do this. So knowing that, probably having that in the back of their heads, even though that had to have been 80 years ago, 60, 80 years ago at this point, because the reign of Saul was 40 years, and it took quite a long time. That was way back when Samuel was a very young man. So it's had to have been at least 60 to maybe 80 years since that account happened. But that might be in their mind. So they're thinking, hey, this is what we're going to do. We're going to put it on a cart, a brand new cart. It's never held anything before. We'll put the ark on there and we'll drive it up. We'll have a team drive it up. We have all these soldiers to accompany it. We'll drive it up to the city of God, to the city of Zion. We'll give it this new regalia, and we'll bring it up in style. We'll bring it up in the way that seems best, because after all, we are now doing for God. We want this to be for God. And we want these great things for God. But that's not quite how that's going to work. And they brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, accompanying the ark of God. And Ahio went before the ark. So they're bringing it out. It's on the cart. They're on the hill. They're going to come down the hill. Ahio's before the ark. He's leading it out. Then David and all the house of Israel played music before the Lord, and on all kinds of instruments of fir wood, on harps, on stringed instruments, on tambourines, on sistrums, and on cymbals. They have all these instruments going. They have everything they could want. They are a moving worship service to God as they move through. They are a moving worship service. Everything they could possibly hope for, they have. Their hearts have got to be lifted. They're doing something mighty for God. They're doing something for themselves. They are now doing something to bless the Lord, bringing him to the heart of his people. And when they came to Nashon's threshing floor, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. Everything's going great. They're doing everything they can. They're on instruments. They're singing. They have instruments going. Now, I've seen some people teach that the first time they took it up, they just had the instruments, and the second time they take it up, they actually point out that they're singing, and it's the voice of people that God all of a sudden loved. You got to pay attention to the details. The worship had nothing to do with it. The worship was not the issue. The worship wasn't all wrong and God made everything stumble and be destroyed. That's not what happened. The worship had nothing to do with it. The worship was probably honorable before God, but he has an issue with it. Now it comes to this threshing floor where they would thresh the wheat. Uzzah puts out his hand. He touches the ark because it's stumbling and it's going to fall out of the cart. Or possibly, and he does not want that ark to fall. No one wants that ark to fall. Not on your watch. I mean, this is the ark of God, that God sits between the cherubim, and you're going to let it fall and hit the ground? You're going to be the one to say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it, I dropped it. No, all of us are going to put our hand out. This is not something about Uzzah that is suddenly this vile, evil thing that is unconscionable that he should have never tried to do. Of course he's going to stick his hand out. Why wouldn't he? So he sticks his hand out. The oxen stumble, he sticks his hand out, he touches the Ark of the Covenant. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his error, and he died there by the Ark of God. And David became angry because the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah, and he called the name of the place Perez Uzzah to this day. So God strikes Uzzah dead for touching it. The ark is tumbling. As I said, we're all going to reach out. We're all going to try to stop it. Anybody would have tried to stop it. Nobody's going to sit there and let it fall. But God's anger was aroused because of it. Now, is it because they weren't singing? They were merely playing instruments? No, there's something far greater going on. And it's a couple... There's a couple issues with what have been done. About the way they're going about bringing the Ark of the Covenant into the new city. About the way they're moving it. They're moving it in the way the pagans moved it. And the unbelievers moved it. And God allowed that to happen so that it could be brought back to his own people. But if we remember, they opened the Ark. When it got to them, they opened it before they sent it to Abinadab's house. It got to a town, they opened it, and multitudes died that day. Multitudes because of them not treating it as holy. Because of the sacrilege of them looking inside the box. So here you have Uzzah sticking out his hand. It has nothing to do with the worship. It has to do with a miscalculation of the whole endeavor to bring the ark in. It should have never been on a cart. The law of Moses prescribed, not just described how they moved it, prescribed how to move it. How it was to be moved. Who was allowed to touch it? Who was allowed near it? And all of this was ignored. Uzzah reached out his hand and he made some miscalculations. Some of them are assumptions because as I said, all of us would have done it. Because we wouldn't have thought it probably is even a reaction. He's not even consciously thinking about it. Anytime you see something start to fall, you reach out to stop it. But he made some big errors. And I've seen commentators point this out as Uzzah's mistake. But I think this is David's mistake as much as it is Ohio and Uzzah's. And I think this mistake that they ascribe to Uzzah is really on David, because he's the leader, he's the king. He's the one demanding it to be moved. Now, Uzzah may have taken it for granted that this has spent all of these decades in the house of his fathers. So he's been accustomed to being near the ark, and he feels that allows him a certain level of discretion in how he's to proceed in handling it. That could be his mistake. But David definitely made the mistake of thinking it didn't matter who carried the ark or how it was carried, what fashion it was carried. He truly believed that this is the way he could do it because he's a man after God's own heart. That God's prescription was merely a description. See, our time today, people have this big issue with Scripture where they take the descriptive and try to make it prescriptive. Just because God's describing something doesn't mean God is commanding you to do it. And in this case, I believe that they probably looked at something that was prescribed. God said, you must do this. And they saw it as being descriptive, as this is how the Israelites had done it. And as I've seen so many people point out, Uzzah's biggest error, and the biggest error we all make, is believing that we are more righteous and we are more holy than the dirt of Nashon's threshing floor. That we are more worthy of being in the presence of God than the dirt, the carbon that we step on, that we were formed from. We're carbon-based life forms. Carbon is dirt. It's in the dust. It's in matter. We're no more holier than the parts that we're assembled from. Our original sin has separated us from God just as creation. We're the same. God created the earth and then created man from it. Right out of the dirt. Right out of the clay. Right out of the mud. We're no holier than that dirt. When it came to obedience, Uzzah was not of more importance or righteousness than the dirt of the ground that he was standing on. When God calls us to follow him and follow his example and follow his lead, we're to listen. When he prescribes things, we're to follow those prescriptions. And if we look back at Numbers 4:15, it says, "And when Aaron and his sons have finished covering the sanctuary and all the furnishings of the sanctuary, when the camp is set to go, then the sons of Kohath shall come to carry them. But they shall not touch any holy thing lest they die. These are the things in the tabernacle of meeting which the sons of Kohath are to carry. And among them is the Ark of the Covenant." They weren't to go in and touch the ark. Aaron, the priestly line of Aaron, was to do it. They were merely to grab the poles and carry the poles. They were assigned a job. They were prescribed certain things that they were to do. And when we look past and take God's prescriptions for granted, we make a huge mistake in believing that we are something more than we are called to be. We make the mistake of believing that we are something far more important than we truly are. We are no more important than the dirt. Our being of creation is no more important than anything. We're important because God loves us and wishes to reconcile with us. But that doesn't mean that we have some form of righteousness that allows us to reach out and touch the holiness of God. As I've said before, I relate to God as a father. And as a father, I have things that my children cannot touch. I have belongings. There are certain rules that are in place to keep them safe that they cannot touch. When you have a firearm in the house, your children are not to touch that. You are to keep that secured and out of their way. And if they go to touch it, if they go to figure out a way into your gun safe or wherever it is that you have hidden, or you have that firearm, mine particularly is in a gun safe, then knowing that they touched it, that is going to bring consequences upon them. Because they are reaching their hand out to touch something that is beyond them. That is not for them. Uzzah reached out to touch something of God's holiness that he was not to touch. He broke the command of the Lord and paid the price for it. Now, how much of a big issue is it touching the ark? Did he sully it? Is God just being cruel? It's an example. There are 30,000 people following the procession of this ark. An example had to be set that the old rules still apply. That no man, no woman, no child is to touch that ark other than who God had prescribed to touch it. That the Lord's rules are not going to be bent for you. God is perfectly just. All must be punished according to their sin. There's no favoritism in God. All must be punished, or he's not holy and perfectly just. Now, people want to make out an interesting question of, well, does this mean that Uzzah is separated from God forever? God's anger was aroused at him. Does his death now mean that he's separated in God because he died in sin? He died at the wrath of God. Does that separate him from the Lord? I don't have the answer to that, but I highly doubt it. And I highly doubt it because of God's ultimate love for his creation and his children. That although he broke this responsibility, if his heart is truly for God, God knows that. So I don't see him as being sent to hell for eternity because he touched the ark when he wasn't supposed to, out of a reaction. His death was more sending a message, in my opinion, for whatever that's worth. Same as Aaron's sons when they presented strange fire before the Lord. That in that moment, their death was to serve as a sign to the rest of the congregation that this is not to be done. And it doesn't matter who does it, there will be no favoritism. David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" So David would not move the ark of the Lord with him into the city of David, but David took it aside into the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. So because of that, he sees Uzzah struck down. David becomes angry at the Lord's outburst because he's trying to do something good. But in David's wisdom, he fears the Lord. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, that awe and wonder, and being afraid, yes, actual fear of the Lord. Understanding that the Lord is the ultimate judge and arbiter of our eternity. That is a good, healthy fear. To understand that he holds our eternity in his hand. And what he chooses to do with it is what will be done. But we take solace in the fact that he is perfectly just and perfectly loving. Perfectly just to punish all sin, but perfectly loving enough to offer us a path, narrow as it may be, to reconciliation into his righteousness through the spilled blood of Christ. that wondrous love he has for us. You know, I saw something online that, of course, is a typical kind of straw man that unbelievers do. But if God is all merciful, then how come? Because he allowed Jesus to die, because, and it's, the whole thing is based off of, if God is all merciful, does he punish anyone for sin? Yes. Well, then he's not all merciful. Well, you have to accept his mercy. Well, then that's not all merciful. God is not all merciful. Not in the sense that that person's using all merciful. God is merciful because he is ultimately loving and ultimately just. Perfectly just, perfectly loving. Leads to his mercy, leads to his grace that allows us a chance at mercy to not pay the wages of the sin that we've accumulated, on top of the original sin, that dead spirit inside that we were born with. That's the mercy of God. That is the wondrous, glorious love of God. When people make straw mans like that, be discerning when you look at it, and know that what they're saying doesn't match up with the description of God. They're making God into a caricature so they can attack it, because they can't attack the actual scripture. They need to take it out of context or make a caricature of it to be able to have any hope of actually attacking it. But David's afraid. How can the ark come to me? I did this thing. I put it on a brand new cart. We pushed it. It slipped. The guy just tried to stop it, and God laid him low and slayed him. How can the ark come? How can the ark come into Jerusalem? How's this going to happen? So I'm not going to try to pull it ahead. I'm going to pull it into Obed-Edom's house. And we're going to leave it there. And as long as it was there, Obed-Edom the Gittite, 3 months, the Lord blessed him. Because Obed-Edom was a Kohathite. He's a Gittite, but he's from the family of Korah and Kohath. He's from the family that is supposed to touch it. It's actually in the right place now. It actually is where it should be, and where God has the ability to utilize these people to show David the correct way. Now it was told King David, saying, "The Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God." So David went and brought up the ark of God to the house of Obed-Edom, or from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with gladness. So it's being told to David, hey, Obed-Edom's house is being blessed 3 months. Everything that belongs to them is being blessed. Everything because of the ark of God. So David's fear is kind of receding, thinking, okay, well, it's not moving the ark. It has to be something else. Because it blessed Abinadab to have it there. Now it's at Obed-Edom's house, and they're being blessed as well. So it's not the Ark of the Covenant being moved it's not having the Ark of the Covenant or moving it that's the issue. Maybe it's something that we're doing. So David went and brought up the Ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with gladness. And so it was, when those bearing the Ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, that he sacrificed oxen and fatted sheep. Then David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting, with the sound of the trumpet. See, that's the part where people say, well, see, they tried to play with all these instruments before, and that angered God. And that's why the oxen stumbled and Uzzah died. But now the Lord is allowing them to bring it up because they're shouting, they're singing, they're playing trumpets. And trumpets relate to Revelation, so clearly that's got to be it. But it's not. Look at the other details of what's going on. Those bearing the ark. So it was when those bearing the ark had gone 6 paces. Now, there's a lot of oxen and fatted sheep now that are being sacrificed. Every 6 steps, they're sacrificing. That's a lot of bloodshed. That's a lot of animals being sacrificed. A lot goes into moving this Ark of the Covenant, far more than they used to when they moved it any other time. But look at that, not on a cart now. Those bearing the Ark of the Covenant like it was done by their forefathers. They're now bearing it as it should have been borne. Now they're worshiping again, singing and cheering. You have David dancing before the Lord with all his might, which a lot of charismatics use to try to cut into a lot of weird stuff that they get into and that they do, because David danced with all his might before the Lord. But he wasn't out of control. He wasn't interrupting a church service to do it. He wasn't doing it so everyone else would see him. And that's actually an important point, because we'll get to that at the end. David dancing with all of his might wasn't for an audience. He was doing it for God. He wasn't doing it in a way that hindered everyone else around. As you can see, he's not hindering the process of bringing this up. His dancing isn't causing them to have to stop and do something. Stop and wait for him. But here he is wearing a linen ephod, wearing a priestly garment as the king. We saw Saul get in trouble for acting out as a priest and sacrificing animals. And here we see David wearing a linen ephod as a priest. But he's not the one doing the sacrifices. He's the one leading worship, leading the dancing, leading the joy of the Lord. And here they are bringing it up to the house of Israel, to the seat of David in Jerusalem. Now as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and twirling before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. So now you have Saul's daughter looking out, despising David, this man she once loved, who she married, who she saved his life at one point. But after he fled, she was given to another man in marriage by Saul. She comes back and now she despises what she sees. So they brought the ark of the Lord. So they brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had erected for it. So he brought the tabernacle up. He set it up. Because remember, the temple will not be until Solomon's time. They bring the tabernacle. They put it in the midst of the tabernacle as it was in the days of Moses. Then David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. And then he distributed among all people, among the whole multitude of Israel, both men and both the women and the men, to everyone a loaf of bread, a piece of meat, and a cake of raisins. So all the people departed, every one to his house. So here you have David coming up, dancing, cheering, shouting, worshiping before the Lord, as it's brought slowly, this slow procession of people bearing the ark into the tabernacle. The altar set up, peace offerings, burnt offerings are being made. Now it says David offered them, but that doesn't mean he's the one actually doing the offering. We know he has priests on his side, so they're the ones probably doing the actual act of offerings. And David's heart poured out for his people. Because as we remember from Deuteronomy and Numbers and Leviticus, when the offerings were offered, certain offerings, people got to keep a portion of it to share as communion between them and the priests and God. So all of these multitude of people of Israel who were in Jerusalem at this time, Now a loaf of bread's being given to him, a piece of meat, a cake of raisins. Now, if you go through different translations, they were all listed something completely different as what's being given, but bread is mostly there. Cake of raisins is there. Some say meat. Some say a flagon of wine. The point being, the offerings are being shared in communion between David the king, the priests, God, and the people. A full communion, a oneness together. Coming together in complete worship before the Lord and before everything and everyone. A beautiful coming together of God's chosen people so that he can now re-inhabit a place among his people in their main city. Then David returned to bless his household. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How glorious was the king of Israel today, uncovering himself today in the eyes of the maids of his servants, as one of the base fellows shamelessly uncovers himself." Now, this is a piece of scripture that is taken way out of proportion and out of context, completely, by more progressive-minded Christians and others who say, David danced with all his might, and he danced naked before them. It says, the daughter of Saul says that he uncovered himself in the eyes of the maidens, in the maids of his servants, and he uncovered himself before their eyes shamelessly. But we just read he was in a linen ephod. He wasn't naked. At no point does it describe him taking off clothes. If you recall, one of the major feasts when the high priest went in to, I believe it was the Day of Atonement, but I could be wrong. When he went to sacrifice, the high priest stripped off his ephod, his priestly ephod, and put on a linen one, because that was the day it was going to get dirtiest. And he put on something more humble so that he could go into the tabernacle, into the ark, and make atonement for the people. David is humbling himself. What she means by uncovering himself is that he doesn't have his royal vestments on. He doesn't look like a king. Just looks like a guy. He looks like just one of the Levite attendants. He looks like everyone else. He looks like no one special. The daughter of Saul, if we remember back to when she was given in marriage, it said Saul gave her to David so that she could be a thorn in his side, that she could be a snare to him, to trip him up. And now it took until after Saul had died for it to happen, but this is the tripping up. This is the greatest day for David. He's king. He's now bringing the ark into the city of God. He is riding so high. He is humble. He is in worship. He is leading his people not just into battle, but in the service of God, in the glory of God, in worship of God, something we never saw King Saul do. Leading in the worship of God, leading in communion with his people, with God. God at the center, God first. But she just sees him as not being regal, not being royal, belittling himself in front of the people he is better than. Because after all, she grew up as a princess, elevated and above all those beneath her. But David didn't grow up that way. He grew up as a poor little shepherd boy. Well, poor might be an exaggeration, but you get the point. He grew up as a young shepherd, not a prince. He didn't have that. He had God. His sling, his staff, his rod. He had loneliness. He had solitude. And he had a small, humble family before the Lord. So David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his house to appoint me ruler over all the people of the Lord over Let me start over because I just mixed a bunch of that up. So David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord over Israel. Therefore I will play music before the Lord, and I will be even more undignified than this and will be humble in my own sight. But as for the maidservants of whom you have spoken, by them I will be held in honor. Therefore Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. It was before the Lord. I mean, that's a shot. Who chose me over your father and the rest of your brothers? That I was chosen over all them to be king? That God chose me for this? So this is a pretty good stabbing, vicious argument. But his point being, it was before the Lord. You think I debased myself? I debased myself before God. Not the people. God. Therefore, if I want to play music to God, I'll play music to God. And you know what? I'll be even more undignified than this. You think this is as low as it is? This is as humble as a king can get? I'll be even more undignified. I'll be humble in my own sight. I'll put my pride completely to the side, my ego completely to the side, to humble myself even further before God. And I'll be honored by these people whose hearts are also for God. Because like them, my heart is for the Lord and the Lord alone. David will sin. David will compromise. We've seen it. We'll see it again. We'll see him make mistakes, and we'll see those mistakes lead to horrific consequences. But this is why he's called a man after God's own heart. Because his own ego means nothing. Nothing to him when he acts before the Lord. Only the Lord matters. Only the Lord makes a difference. It is the Lord who is the one that matters. Jesus said, if anyone does not hate their mother and their father and love me, they're not worthy of me. It's not that you hate your mother and father. It's not that you hate your children, your siblings, your spouse. It's that no one is to be before God. No one comes before Jesus. No one. Not a single person on this physical planet comes before God. It is Him who we humble ourselves before. It is Him who we dance before, we worship before, who we lower ourselves before, and we bring ourselves low in submission to. It is Him and Him alone. That is the heart that God is looking for, one who seeks Him in all things and in all times. We're all chosen for something. Might not be chosen to lead His people, but chosen for something, some job, no matter how humble it may be, and how meaningless or debased it might seem to the world. We are all chosen for something. And no matter humble it may seem to those who look at materialistic things and look at how much gold and silver you can amass, how big your bank account can be. Doesn't matter how humble it looks in their eyes. All that matters is how we look in the eyes of God. So no matter what it is you do it to the fullest before the Lord, in His presence, seeking His will, so that way His name can be glorified. His kingdom could be seen as a shining light for people. And we can be honored by the only one that matters, God Himself. So that's where we shall end it for this morning. I hope this was fruitful for you. I hope to see you back again next time. But until then, be blessed.